faithful host James, and I'm so excited to be talking to today's author, Mr. Gerald Clark, and we're going to be discussing Gerald's work, The Anunnaki of Nibiru, Mankind's Forgotten Creators, Enslavers, Destroyers, Saviors, and Hidden Architects of the New World Order. And Gerald is a mechanical engineer, and I just love having fellow engineers on the show to discuss ancient history. I seem to be collecting a lot of these authors on the show, and people can refer to the archives for the other shows. And this is what brings merit to the show. And Gerald's going to get into a little bit about his career and how he got into this wonderful subject himself. So I don't want to ruin the biography. And so without further ado, let's bring on our guest. Hi, Gerald. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Capricorn Radio.
Hi, James. It's really great to be here, and I want to wish a warm welcome to all your listeners.
Oh, thank you, brother. Thank you. And like I said in the intro, we've got a mechanical engineer here.
Well, actually, I'm an electrical engineer, so.
Oh, sorry. I do electromechanical. I don't distinguish between the two.
No.
Sorry, you're electrical engineer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you got into some wonderful breakdown in the book, which is why I think your book about the Anunnaki is so different to most out there. And you know, I think a lot of people have took Sitchin's work and carried the flag and kept going and, you know, looked into all the text and stuff, Gerald. And you've applied an engineering and scientific discipline to this, too, Gerald, as well. And that's what gives you body and a difference to the other people out there. Before we get into the book, Gerald, let's tell me about you, the author. Tell me about Gerald, the engineer. How you got into this subject? It's a bit of a turnaround from your career. Is this a hobby? Have you always been into history? What was the catalyst that got you into this subject, Gerald?
It's a good question. I've told this version of the story multiple times. I actually never really realized that part of my influence and my drive to figure out the state of the world happened when I was 14. And I was in the front yard of my kind of remote farm in the northwest corner of Arkansas. And we were about, I don't know, 12 miles north of where Walmart started. Actually, that's where we lived, if you know where that is in the country. Anyway, little unknown fact there. I was standing out in the yard kicking a ball up into a walnut tree. About 5 or 5:30 p.m. It was real calm. Usually, you know, at the end of the day when the sun's starting to chill out, the thermals have stopped and it's very still. One of my favorite times. Anyway, I'm kicking a ball up in the tree trying to knock walnuts down. And suddenly, something caught my attention just to my right in a little cow field just across this dirt road where we lived. And a silver disc at about 100 feet off the ground was just hovering, coming north to south very slowly, not even 5 miles an hour, very slow. And I thought, oh my gosh, whatever that is. You know, my primal instinct, I was a pitcher in baseball, is to pick up a rock and throw it at me. And I thought, no, I don't think that's a good idea. And I just sat and watched it. And then I ran the house, grabbed my mom, we went on the back porch and watched as it flew over our garden, right over our cow pasture, and then back over the wooded area in the back of our house. It was just rolling hills covered with trees. And it looks like broccoli in the summer when all the trees are in bloom. But at this time of the year, it was actually somewhat later in the year. But we just watched this thing fly close to the tops of the trees, and it was following the contour of the trees, kind of like later in my life, and I'll tell you that part in a minute. I became a helicopter pilot, and we call that napping the earth, you know, how he was flying. So didn't think much about it, and I really never thought about the encounter. I was so close. I mean, probably only 60 feet away, and you know, so I thought, well, I told my mom, I said, well, maybe it was an advanced military craft that is working with Fort Chaffee down near Little Rock, and that's the direction it was heading. And I never thought about it again. I had never heard of a UFO. We were, you know, this was quite a number of years ago. I won't date myself. Anyway, so that had some influence that I really never recognized until much later in my life when I got into this. So, interestingly enough, when I was in engineering at UCSD studying, I first started out as a computer engineer, and then I got my graduate degree in electrical engineering. Mm-hmm. And so as an undergrad, I had an interest in all things artificial intelligence because I worked at an AI company for 7 years. And we did lots of research into how the brain works, how to write computer models of the brain, how to do situation assessment, how to do sensor fusion, and apply what we do in complex situations as humans to try to teach machines to do this. You know? In retrospect, it doesn't sound like a very good idea, does it? So during that exposure to artificial intelligence, I learned about a couple of things, and they really interested me because I had an interest in evolution, just the evolution of man. I was a truth seeker in a sense, and I was watching Australopithecus africanus, the famous Lucy artifacts that showed up in the San Diego Natural History Museum, and I definitely went to see that because I had read about this. I was like, wow, could this be our missing link? I was way back at the time where people were still recovering from the false missing link fiascos that have gone down, like Piltdown Man and all the other things that have happened in the past. But this one looked interesting because there were real bones that you could check out. So I had an interest in evolution. And while I was in college, having been exposed to artificial intelligence and genetic algorithms and all the things that go with, the various disciplines in AI, one of them was data mining that you would turn into expert system rules. So you'd capture a rule set from an individual that could then be turned into software code that could model how a human acts. So it's a rule-based system, not a if-then system. Even though they're similar, but imagine a microprocessor firing off when it gets a rule satisfied or multiple rules satisfied at the same time that then causes the fetch, decode, execute cycle. Well, this is what we were doing, and this is what humans do. So anyway, with that exposure, while I was at UCSD, I got heavily involved in doing research into evolutionary hardware, causing hardware to adapt itself to its inputs because of the reconfigurable parts that you can get now, right? So I was always kind of interested in the theory of evolution, and what I discovered in my grad school work was that, and this ought to be obvious to the most casual observer now, is that evolution is not a good solution for applying to real-time problems. Evolution takes iterations and time for it to get right. Now with a computer you can do things much faster, but in biological systems it doesn't happen quickly. And this is where I got confused, because what I discovered was there wouldn't be any possible way for any life to still be on this planet given the catastrophes that have occurred and the vast temperature changes that have occurred for animals that are sensitive to temperature, like reptiles, that they could have survived. Because some of these catastrophes lasted for years and tens of years, maybe even hundreds. So how could a creature survive in an instantaneous temperature change? How is this possible? Well, later in my research, I discovered that environmental stressors seem to have the ability to cause DNA to change and adapt to real-time stressors. For instance, there was some research done on a chicken egg recently. And through the embryonic stages, and now they haven't applied this to stages beyond the embryo, but to my knowledge, maybe they have. But during the embryonic stages, you can introduce certain chemicals that would represent an environmental stressors could have a real-time impact as well. So I mentioned a chicken egg was under research recently, and as they added stressors to it while it was in its embryonic state, injecting certain chemicals to represent certain stressors that would have happened to the chicken, they were able to cause the DNA of this embryo to produce features that went way back in the chicken's history, even having feet that looked like a dinosaur, and teeth as well. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. This kind of makes me rethink my evolutionary theory that genetic mutations don't only happen at birth. That's how it's modeled. Is there some deformity, and the environment supports it, it's chosen in the life function determined to propagate that feature, and then everybody else has it pretty soon, and everyone that doesn't dies. That's usually, that takes time. That's generational for that to happen, okay? And as we just mentioned, if the temperature changed overnight, they'd have to adapt immediately or they'd be gone. So another example of genetics changing real time, consider your pink pig in a barnyard, when they're kept in a safe environment and fed, whether they don't have to forage, and they look like Porky the Pig. But you put one of those out in the wild and force it to survive, and next thing you know, it goes feral. So the environmental stressors change, and the biological constructs of that pig will change too. So that really kind of made me start thinking about, well, does that apply to humans too? Could we be exposed to stressors such that our DNA changed? So it planted a seed in my mind that I was carrying forward for a long time. So to supplement that, I studied quadratic networks in grad school that models how the human brain could be modeled in software. including bidirectional associative memory and the whole thing. And it really made me realize at that point in time, and this is 98, I would say, we truly understood the human brain and how it worked, and we could model it in software. So the idea of putting that as a rule set into a robot was really quite frightening. And now if you look at Japan and the United States and the UK have done with robotic technology, it's quite amazing. Go look up Titan the Robot just for a laugh on YouTube and see as this thing is touring the world. It's kind of scary actually. So how did evolutionary aspirations lead to the Anunnaki? Everybody has to be wondering that. Well, I was interested in the truth of human origins, and looking at evolution and all. I realized that we truly did not know, or we were being lied to, one or the other. And academia was not the place to find the answers. So anyway, make a long story short, I was traveling as an executive in telecom, doing some patent work with some folks over in Turkey. And they were going after the telecom market, and we had a technology that we were helping them with at a company I was working at. And while I was there, I got exposed to their culture. I was there for several times. Trying not to be an ugly American, I tried to learn a little bit about their culture, as they knew a lot about ours, because a couple of them had been educated in America. So we were out at dinner one night and talking, and they had taken me to a place called, what they called their Mount Olympus in Bursa, Inigal, Turkey. And it just so happened it was the headquarters where the Byzantine Empire was destroyed by the Ottomans, and Ataturk became famous at that site. So there was some real history going on there, and they were dropping a few historical bombs on me that completely violated my understanding of our chronology that was taught in school. It usually starts in Greece and goes forward. They definitely aren't talking about Egypt very much, or Sumeria for sure. Okay. So anyway, one thing led to another, and I was reading this book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, where it was talking about a few places in Turkey that were much older than what I believed was the oldest civilization we had found. And of course, I was focused on Egypt. Everybody thought about Egypt being at 3100 BC was the oldest. And and I wasn't never a historian. I was an engineer. I wasn't really that interested. But something that happened there that really caught my interest, in that some of the symbols on the mosque really drew me in. I was like, well, what do those mean? As an engineer, I'm curious. These 3 descending orbs, a crescent moon, and the architectural structure of the mosque is quite amazing anyway, to have something that looks like a UFO and rockets surrounding it. It's really bizarre. One thing led to another, and I started doing some research. And about, I guess it was around the year 2000, and the telecom market in San Diego was really in descendancy, and the investors that we were working with kind of told us, this would be a really kind of a good time to take a hiatus before we have to fire you, because the money's drying up. A lot of us took the clue and kind of took a little hiatus as things got restructured. And while I had a little bit of downtime in between gigs, I decided, well, this would be a good time to catch up on all the things I never got to read. And, working startup companies, you work 16 hours a day, so you don't have any time to look into the stuff. So I was really excited to have a little downtime to look into it. So I started reading, and I was going to write a book on ancient technology, I figured. I was an engineer. I figured that would be right up my alley. And so I started with structural stuff. I saw things like Baalbek, Lebanon, where they had 1,000-ton stones at the third rung of the wall that nobody could move today. I'm thinking, So they had structural or engineering knowledge that we apparently didn't have. So that's where I started. So I bought a book on ancient transportation and technology and started researching that space. And the next thing I know, I stumbled upon Zecharia Sitchin's work. Yeah, and so and I'd read some of Velikovsky's too, and I noticed you'd done a recent interview with someone about Velikovsky and the Dogon.
And
yeah, and so anyway, so I and I had a little bit of knowledge about that as well. So the next thing I know, I've read all Sitchin's stuff, and I'm in this crazy pursuit to help my kid. He was born with a genetic disorder called DeGeorge syndrome. And he's got loose structural tissue on his legs. Okay, you're going, now how does this get to the Anunnaki? Okay. Well, little did I know that while I just read all Sitchin stuff, and it kind of blew my mind in a way, and I started corroborating, I guess, from that point. I started looking into some of the things he said to see what we knew. And so I, being an engineer, the first thing to do is started jotting down all the darn names that showed up in his account, and that led to a about a 7-foot genealogy table that starts out prehistory on Nibiru and goes all the way forward, includes the Sumerian kings list and some of the genealogy work from Lawrence Gardner. It was fabulous. And I combined those three together into a genealogy table to try to make sense of this whole name soup that was going on. But while that was happening, I was participating in structural work in Hawaii in order to learn a kind of an alternative healthcare method that could help my kid. And make a long story short, I got exposed to somebody who knew a lot about history and it was very, very widely read and kind of and then the idea of the Anunnaki came up because I was the first person I'd ever talked to about Sitchin's work. And so it wasn't a long conversation, but it was enough trading back and forth of some of the tangible evidence I'd come across corroborating once I'd read his theory to look in further, and it bolstered me to look a little bit farther because I really respected this guy, and if he was willing to look into this and even talk about it, maybe I wasn't so crazy by looking into a theory about the origins of man that was so fantastic but was so scientific. It really appealed to the left side of my brain. So starting out, Zecharia Sitchin told us to go read some really important documents that inspired him on his search for human origins, and two of them he mentioned was the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis. And so I jotted this down, and I was a Sitchinite totally by that time anyway, because I read all his stuff, even the latest stuff that he's just published. And so, and I found it fascinating, and I took notes, and I studied this, and I compared it with his timelines, and I checked to see what evidence was in Africa, what had been discovered with our infrared satellites to determine what objects were in our solar system that nobody was telling us about, and blah blah blah. Okay, so I was in a corroboration mode for quite a while, so I started writing this book, the Anunnaki of Nibiru. I guess I would say 2004. So I've been looking at this stuff since 2000. I started writing it in 2004. I was very excited. I figured I'd stumbled on something that everybody needed to know, especially after decoding the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis. I kind of came up with what I call my God table that let me track their names across multiple cultures, and I put this in my book so that people would have it. And I started using that God table to make sense of some of the symbols I was seeing around the world in various countries and who was at odds with who. And all of a sudden, this concept of the Enlilites and Inkyites started making a lot of sense to me, where it looked like there was a Hatfield-McCoy kind of feud going on. It had been going on a long time. So that said, it led me to the idea of this human origin story that Sitchin had told, and also existed on tablets that were on display in museums that we could clearly decode now. I was really confronted with my belief system, totally, and I was raised Southern Baptist, okay, and I was a serious Southern Baptist, no messing around, and I truly had read the Bible very thoroughly, and things in the Bible disturbed me. So I guess I was a bit open to reading other books outside of the Bible, even though those on the inside that have signed up to the dogma, say I'm going to be a member, are highly encouraged not to read anything outside of the Bible, which I find ridiculous. I dug in really hard and started reading the Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish, and the Epic Gilgamesh, because in those three accounts it introduced all the players and what happened to us, and kind of set up the state of what we're in now. If you extrapolate forward one zodiacal house, you go, wow, okay, I get it now. So I'm going to jump back, give a little prehistory, and then lead up to some of the other questions that we had as well. Is that okay? Okay.
Please do, Gerald. Please. This is fascinating.
Okay. So I'm gonna try to do Sitchin a little justice here, and I have a pretty good memory, so I remember a lot of the timelines and stuff. And if it turns into name soup for you, it's too much. In my book, and I've even put it online, some of it online. And I'm gonna publish my genealogy table, the digital version, very shortly. I just completed signing off on it today. We've been working on this for quite a while. Okay, so I have published the photo, the picture of the genealogy table, and I gave it to people. It is a bit hard to read, though. Okay, so what's the story? What is the true history and origins of mankind, to my knowledge, given an engineering filter with the best, I don't know. I wouldn't call it a belief system. I would call it a stopping point in the dialogue with the best information we have. That's where I'm at. Okay, you with me? Okay, so that said, what do we know in the Sumerian records that we found? And there's been lots of them. I mean, lots of them, tens of thousands of them, and they're able to be digitized. And there's a whole uniform code text that you can download from your computer that has Sumerian uniform code on it. So it's fully. There's no decipherment issues to my knowledge. Okay. So that said, 450,000 years ago, according to the timeline, there were problems on another planet in our solar system called Nibiru. They were having atmospheric difficulties because every time they came close perihelion with the sun, being out in a 3,600-year retrograde orbit, they were having devastating effects happen to their atmosphere. And they were very sensitive to radiation. Apparently their planet's geothermally heated. Being that far out past Pluto, they don't receive a lot of direct solar heating, and so they manage their greenhouse accordingly. So the atmosphere is designed to keep heat in and radiation out. According to the Sumerian prehistory documents, and I have these on the genealogy table, at the time that these perturbations were happening, about 450,000 years ago, their king was named Alalu, and he was an unjust ruler who had usurped the throne from another ruler named Lamu. Now, by the way, some of these names, if you pay attention to them, they also show up in the genealogy table, and they're affiliated with planets. So you had been talking with your guest who was doing the Dogon, and he was talking about Velikovsky's association of myths with the planetary astrology. Well, listen, it's serious. And I have a whole table to summarize who did what to who, okay? Yeah. And this all comes from the Enuma Elish, by the way, if you read that. This is the Babylonian Epic of Creation that describes how our solar system came to be. So the idea of Venus being an oddity, while I'm on that topic, consider the fact if you take the orbit of Earth around the sun, let's call it 365, and I know there's questions about that, and Venus is 225, you divide that, you get 1.618. Does that number ring a bell? Yeah, wow. That's a trip, huh? That's the number, the design number phi that shows up everywhere. So, so that comes from the Fibonacci sequence, doing the.
I never.
Yeah, where you divide, where you divide the previous the Fibonacci number by its previous, and after a very short order, it collapses to 1.618. This is the design number of quote unquote God to a lot of people. Yeah.
And the Italians use it for the design of beauty.
Right, right. Well, this number went into building all kinds of architectures. It's in your body. It's everywhere. So I found that very interesting that Earth and Venus were uniquely related that way. None of the other ones are the way I checked, being an engineer. So where were we? So 450,000 years ago, disturbances on the planet, atmospheric problems, Alalu's in charge. He basically has an encounter with his rightful cupbearer who was supposed to be in charge, and his name was Anu. And he's in my genealogy table as well. His wife's name was Antu. Anu finally had enough of this unjust ruler. They had a wrestling match. That's how they solved things there. Naked. Very interesting. They wrestled. He won. Alalu then was going to be, after he lost the rulership, he was going to be tried for his usurpation where he pushed somebody out the window. And about that time, he got a space vessel, left Nibiru, escaped, and he was going to be exiled anyway. He escaped into exile and landed on the Earth. Well, apparently they'd been doing spectroscopic studies of all the planets in retrograde orbit. They had a mobile observatory and had discovered gold on the Earth. And gold being such a great radiation shield, we use it in space on rad hard parts and all kinds of things now. Clearly they knew about it. And he reported back to Nibiru that there was gold here, and he wanted back in. He didn't want to be in exile. So he was using this as a leverage to help mitigate their environmental problems and get his political way. Well, Anu then decided, okay, so he sent his firstborn son, who was a scientist, their premier scientist. His planet affiliation was Neptune. He was called Ea Nudimmud in the Enuma Elish account, but his actual name to us on Earth was Enki. So Enki, about 5,000 years later, about 445,000 years ago, came to Earth. He landed in the Persian Gulf in a vessel in his fish suit, walked ashore, decided that he was going to connect with Alalu, and then determined whether this report of gold was true. They did find gold in the Persian Gulf, and it was both in monoatomic form and in colloidal solution in the ocean, and that's how they were going to mine it initially. So they built the city of Eridu, right where the Tigris and Euphrates meet, and empty into the Persian Gulf. So the very first city on this planet that we know of, at least from that civilization, was about 445,000 years ago, and it still exists today, and you can see it from Google Earth. The bricks are sticking out of the sand. It does not look like it's been excavated, and I cannot understand why. That said, they weren't getting gold fast enough, and apparently Lalu then had another encounter with Anu there on the planet, and he ended up in his final exile because he did not get back in on Mars, where they built a pyramid edifying his face there where he died. So the pyramid on Mars is Lalu's face. Very, very interesting. And there were one of his, I think it was Anzu, one of the Anzu clan also went there with him and died. So Enki proceeded to try to get gold. Apparently he wasn't getting it fast enough in the Persian Gulf. He then was vectored to Africa, the southeast corner of Africa, down along the Zambezi River. And apparently they were successful there, started mining gold. He had brought about 50 workers with him initially. They were called the Igigi, I-G-I-G-I, that shows up in the Atrahasis account. And after many shars, according to the Atrahasis, a shar is 3,600 years. And you can verify that in the Sumerian kings list, though, because they list their rulerships in shars. So 8 shars, for instance, is 28,800 years if you look at the first Sumerian king. Wow. So they had been working many shars on the earth. Remember, we're back 445,000 years ago. Now move forward probably a couple 100,000 years they've been working in these mines. Okay, they finally had enough, and by that time it looks like they had about 600. They revolted, and in the Atrahasis account, Allah gave his fellow gods a speech, riled them up, told them to burn their tools, and they headed to his dad's house, Enlil's house, who had a fortress there in South Africa, and demanded relief. Okay, this is all documented on Sumerian tablets, by the way. This is not me making stuff up. About this time, the Anunnaki called a council meeting. Anu was summoned, Enki was summoned, Ninurta was summoned, and several of them were there. And basically, we got to find out what a brutal taskmaster this Enlil character was. Now, who is Enlil? Enlil was sent 5,000 years later than Enki to the Earth to kind of be the commander, if you will. Enki was a scientist. He probably wasn't that great at bureaucratic, machinations, but his brother was actually in line to rule. He was a higher ranking than Enki. His rank was 50, and Enki's rank was 40. So Enlil comes down, was given the Mesopotamian region, and Enki's down in Africa mining gold. Okay, with these Igigi who weren't producing it fast enough, eating for Enlil. So Enlil ended up with a fortress down there to drive it a little faster. So here they are surrounding his house. They burned all their tools, and Allah, of all names, think about that, turns out is Nanar Sin, who is Enlil's son, his oldest son. So the moon god, Allah, is Enlil's son. And he was also on the Sumerian council in 3760 BC. He held rank there. So now they're surrounding their house. They have a council meeting, say, what are we going to do? Enlil says, hey, let's just kill one and make him go back to work. So you can kind of get an idea what this guy's like. He, by the way, it's clearly not a friend of mankind. Okay, I just want to put that out there. And the whole account is written autobiographically by Atrahasis, who turns out to be related to Enki. And I'm going to save that one for a second. So so they're surrounding the house. They want relief, and the council calls a few other members together, including Ninhartsag, who was Enki's half sister. So we got Enlil, Enki, and Ninhartsag. They're all the children of Anu, who is there. Okay, but Enlil and Enki are half brothers, and Ninhartsag is their half sister, and she's the medical officer known as Isis in Egypt. Very important person. Okay, so about this time, Anu and Enki go, well, I don't know. I think you've worked them a little hard. I think they do deserve relief. And they bantied about whether to produce tools or how they were going to replace these. They call them gods. I mean, these Igigi were not, mutant subservients. They were apparently very capable. They just so happened to be the ones doing the work. So they got together and decided that they were going to produce a primitive worker to replace the Igigi miners. And the faster, the better. They appointed who else but the scientist and the medical officer to go and do that. And that was Enki and his half-sister Ninhartsag. So in the accounts, in the Sumerian documents, he had a house of Shimti in South Africa, his lab, his genetics lab, where they messed around with the bipedal hominids. Remember I talked about Lucy, who was 3.5 million years old, where Lewis and Leakey found her. But there were other hominids that had survived that were much, like the Neanderthal, and they apparently go back about 1 million years forward, and in between there was even some talk about whether it was Cro-Magnon or Neanderthal, but it was about 220,000 years ago, according to the genetic record. And this is from the Genetic Eve and Genetic Adam study that was tracked to determine our origins. And they both point about 200,000 years ago in South Africa, the same area where these gold mines were found. Okay? So let's talk about that just a little bit. So in South Africa, Michael Tellinger went down there based on the same Sumerian story and was looking for the gold mines that these Anunnaki were mining. In particular, Enki and Enlil was there too, okay? But it was primarily Enki's gig. And of course, he found a lot of stone structures. A lot of the gold mines were found as well. So the Anglo-American Mining Corporation turns out and owns a lot of these, and it actually even carbon dated some of them. So you have to ask yourself, first of all, and they carbon dated them to about 100,000 years old. Who was mining gold in South Africa 100,000 years ago? And the Sumerians tell us who it was. So I went forward that. I'm like, okay, so, just another corroborating piece of information, right? So our first genetic studies show that they came out of there, and now all of a sudden the gold mines are in the same place. So putting two and two together, it made a lot of sense. So through the Atrahasis account, they talk about all the iterations they went through to produce these chimeras, these genetic primitive workers to replace the Gigi, and they were finally successful. And later on in another account, they actually took that Adapa to meet Anu back on Nibiru, so they could introduce him to this primitive worker that was created. And it's a very detailed account. In that account, it was really important what came out of it, and that Anu ordered one of the escorts to be mankind's teacher. And that turns out to be none other than Enki's son, Ningshita, who was also there because he was a scientist as well, and he was the one responsible for the genetic upgrade so the first primitive workers could procreate. Ningshita escorted both of them up to the Garden of Eden, which was in the city of Eridu, and he was the caduceus bearer. He was very scientific. He was Enki's premier son. And he was known as Thoth in Egypt. So I just wanted to introduce his role there before we move forward with this story about Atrahasis. So at that point, let's go up to the Garden of Eden in Samaria, which is the city that Enki built when he first landed there 445,000 years ago. So it's right at the southern end of where the Tigris and Euphrates dump into the Persian Gulf, just as a reminder. And I found some pictures online of the city. It was very interesting. It was taken in 1973 by the University of Chicago, and it showed a couple of the archaeologists walking around with a few of the bricks sticking out of the ground. There was a Google Earth overhead view that you can see of Eridu as well, so I encourage people to get on Google Earth and go check it out. And it looks completely undisturbed. Like, why have they not excavated this most important site on the planet? Probably have, to some degree. We just don't know about it.
Sure.
So at the Garden of Eden, Enki and Enlil were there primarily. So this is your Genesis account of the Garden of Eden. Now you realize the Sumerian account is much older, and who was really there. So they were there to observe this genetic upgrade that Ningshita had performed, so that these primitive workers that were the chimeric combination of the Anunnaki, Enki himself, along with ovum from a female bipedal hominid that they found roaming on the steppes of Africa. So that's really who we are, a mixture of Anunnaki and Neanderthal genes. So at this point, they're watching them in the garden to see if they can procreate. And this is where all the crazy dogma of the church gets imposed on mankind, our fallen state and so on and so forth. Well, the reality was Enlil was not in his, it was his territory by that point, but the city of Eridu was still Enki's. So, and he had a temple there and everything else. So the fact that they're out in his medicinal garden looking at these primitive workers that were naked and determining, whether they're going to produce enough offspring to meet the labor requirement, Enlil tells them don't eat any specific plant in Enki's garden because, he was a scientist. He's out gathering all different kinds of plants from all over the planet, probably the Amazon rainforest. He probably knew all about MAO inhibitors and DMT too. So, so anyway, Enlil tells him don't eat it or you'll die in the Genesis account, right? And then, of course, the evil snake that shows up, the caduceus bearer, twin serpents going up a pole, was representative of a snake to Enlil, but reality was it was a symbol for a geneticist. So this evil snake was there. It turned out to be Enki, and Enki says, "No, actually, you won't die. You'll just acquire the consciousness that we have." And he was telling them the truth, right? So, and you read the account. Guess what? They didn't die. They had a consciousness changing experience, and Enlil got pissed and threw them out of the garden. That's the real story of what happened. So, but they were successful at procreating. So that was the real test, and that's what they were there for. So while they were being watched like lab animals to see if they could do their thing, they finally realized they could. Actually, the Adapa, or Adam, was he was intercepted by Enki, taken off to his temple, and taught everything that he knew, while Enlil had thrown him out, put him in exile. They went on to have offspring, and Enki had an offspring with Eve, and you can see that in my genealogy table. I'll show you. That one was Cain, and the other one was Abel. So you realize the genealogy of the story about Cain and Abel, why that was so important. And even in that account, in the Sumerian account, it introduces Marduk and Ninurta, the offspring of Enki, and an offspring of Enlil, training Cain and Abel. So there was other sources of conflict behind that whole story, which when you read the Sumerian accounts are very illuminating. Okay, so we've left the Garden of Eden now. Let's fast forward 600 years of the successful breeding program that's been implemented by the Anunnaki. And if you go back to Genesis as well, when the flood came, it was 600 years after Noah was the king of the city of Shuruppak. Well, Shuruppak is a city there. It was pre-diluvial in southern Iraq. And it turned out it was the medical center for Ninhursag. Okay, so he's the king of the city, and she's the medical officer that's taking up residence there. So keep that in mind as you now reread that. Well, at this point, apparently Enlil had been watching some of the primitive workers that he'd absconded with from South Africa and brought them up to Mesopotamia to serve him. And, he was still letting them run around naked like animals, drinking out of puddles, like animals. And apparently something that they were doing was really pissing him off. And he called a council meeting, and this is in the Altrahasis account. After 600 years, he said the people had grown too broad, and they were bellowing like a bull, and he wanted them silenced. So he decided somehow this council agreed to his wishes. He was the top of the council anyway, holding the Lord of the Earth command at rank 50. Well, in the Altrahasis account, he asked that a disease be introduced to the populace for culling them. Now imagine that. Imagine that as a governing methodology here in the United States or there in Ireland, Well, yeah, we got too many people and they're making too much noise, so just introduce this disease over here.
Genocide.
It's total genocide, premeditated genocide. Okay, so it started, and I'll just fast forward and not get too negative on this because we've got a lot of ground to cover. So he introduced a couple of diseases, a Saku disease, a Ripu disease. That didn't do enough damage, and you can read in the Altrahasis of the effects of these diseases. It was nasty. I remind you of the Black Plague, Black Death in Europe in the Middle Ages.
Sure.
So then that wasn't enough. Cut off the food, cut off the water, anything he could to get rid of these primitive workers that his genetic half-brother was conducting a genetic war against him and occupying and controlling the earth. That's how he probably viewed it as the commander. Right? He had no problem wiping them out whatsoever. Now, were they evil all the time like the canonical Bible says? I don't know. Maybe, but they were also down in the mines working their ass off day and night for Enlil, so maybe they weren't evil while they were doing that. You know what I'm saying? So let's go forward. The final act that Enlil asked his half-brother to do to get rid of the humans was to bring a flood and destroy the rest of them. And each iteration of these attacks by Enlil on the populace, these genocidal incursions, Enki pushed back, and he used and counseled Altrahasis on what to do about it. He actually, at one point, he reminded me of Gandhi and how he told, when they cut off the food supply, he told them to bake bread and go give it to one of Enlil's kids. I can't remember which one. It wasn't Iskar. I think it was Nintaba. Yeah, it was Nintaba, and he was the one that controlled the grains, apparently. Well, so they were given the task to go shame him into stopping what he was doing by baking him a nice couple of loaves of bread. And apparently, these tactics that Enki came up with worked for a while. Finally, Enlil had enough. Well, absolutely ordered his brother. He was a higher-ranking guy. He was like, "Do it, bring a flood and wipe them out." And the whole council was sworn to secrecy, not to tell anyone that it was going to happen. Now, whether it was, and there's controversy over this, whether it was the passing of Nibiru that caused
The flood.
caused the flood by breaking off a polar ice cap and causing a huge tsunami, which was reported by them, by the way. Whether it was that or whether Enki actually had something to do with it. I think actually, knowing Enki as a benefactor, I don't think he would have done that. But if some event was coming and he was sworn not to tell anyone about it, that's a possibility, especially if it was a natural event.
Mm.
So apparently he swore his oath. He then decided to go to the king of Shurupak's house and talk to the wall and disclose the story without actually talking to Atrahasis himself. So Atrahasis is the name of the account. It turns out another name, he had other names, okay? And of course, we know him as Noah, right? But they knew him as Ziusudra and Atrahasis, and in the Epic of Gilgamesh, they called him Utnapishtim, okay? So Gilgamesh referred to him as Utnapishtim, he of the far away, or he who had found life, I think is what he referred to. So anyway, Enki discloses to Atrahasis at the reed hut that this flood's coming to get his boat. And he's the king of Shuruppak. So now he's got to tell the elders some story that they're going to believe, so he can get out. So Enki told him that he was having problems with his half brother Enlil, and that since it was now Enlil's territory, that he had to leave. So Atrahasis built the boat as Enki told him to, and packed it up. Apparently, it was more of a genetic seed bank on afloat than it was bringing two animals of every kind. They probably brought their domesticated animals that they had local on their farm, but Enki and
Norway, Gerald, haven't we? We've got a seed bank in Norway.
there's a couple of them around the world. Some of the wealthy of the world have seen to that, especially in the cold places where where they don't need refrigeration. So Enki directs a navigator that's related to him also on the boat, take Atrahasis and his family to Mount Ararat, and about that time, the Anunnaki bust out of the cities in their winged discs to avoid the calamity. While they were in the air surveying flood damage, Nin Hartzog, who was the mother of us all, right? This is Enki's half-sister that bore the first baby for him kind of through this in vitro fertilization, and many other after that. She was aghast at the carnage that this flood had brought, looking at the humans down in the clay like they were little sticks, washed up in piles. It's just unbelievable how she had been talked into this covenant with Enlil to keep quiet about what's coming. And it goes on, and it's very dramatic. But about that time, Enlil looks and sees a vessel on Mount Ararat and gets highly irate, wanting to know who broke their oath to the humans such that anything survived. And he uses a self-referential term for the Anunnaki at this point, which I hadn't seen other places, where he calls himself the Anuna. So it's kind of short for Anunnaki, the Anuna.
Wow, like a nickname.
Yeah. So they take their winged disc, and he and Nin Hartzog and Enki and there was one other in there, I can't remember, and Enlil was there. They landed on the hill, found Atrahasis there. He had built an altar to kind of give credence to his father, Enki, it turns out. So this gets exposed here on the hill. So Enki gets lambasted by Enlil for somehow breaking his oath. Enki kind of confesses, and he goes, "I did it in defiance of you, so that life would be sustained, because we can't survive here without their help." They do all our food, they do all our labor. I mean, imagine having to do all that yourself.
Mm.
So then at that point, he finally admits to Enlil that Atrahasis is his son, and that's why he saved him. So the idea that Noah was Enki's son is so important. Now think about the whole silly Noah movie that just came out, and what a red herring that whole thing is.
Sure.
Yeah. So anyway, everybody likes to hear the Noah flood story. But actually, that brings us up to the point in the Fertile Crescent in Turkey and Syria and Iraq. The whole area in there was termed the Fertile Crescent, around the south end of the Black Sea, because it was where agriculture really took off. And the reason it was important to mankind is they've done genetic studies to look at this, and this comes up in the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, where Jared Diamond describes, how we've identified that our domesticated cattle and grains came from that area about 12,000 years ago. Well, this is coincident with the last ice age when apparently this polar ice cap broke off and caused the flood. So yeah. So gee, from the chronology standpoint, looking at history, it all makes sense. So now you come forward from that Fertile Crescent area, knowing that domestic sheep showed up there and cattle. Yeah. And read the Sumerian accounts. They actually described after taking the Adapa to Nibiru to meet Anu, two very important people accompanied him, and then there's a story afterwards. So Dumuzi and Ningshita both went. Dumuzi was an offspring of Enlil, and I thought it was Enki until I looked at my genealogy table the other day. Whoops. And Ningshita was Enki's son. So they were both summoned to take the Adapa to meet Anu. Well, Dumuzi got kept back on Nibiru. I think they kept him back to study the effects of gravity on his body over a long exposure on the planet. But Ningshita was sent forward, and in one Shar's time, they said they were going to send Dumuzi back with the essence of ewes. And basically, he was going to bring the genetics back from these creatures so they could spawn them on the Earth, including several seed grains and crops. So everybody's very excited when Dumuzi showed back up after being retained on Nibiru for a Shar, with this, with these with seeds and genetic material, which landed in the Fertile Crescent area and then got propagated through everyone else. So I think that's a really neat genetic study. Okay, so I once again gave credence to Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. The reason being is I was traveling to Turkey, reading that book, and absorbing this material and realizing that happened in the very area where I was visiting.
Wow.
Yeah, so...
You were in Kayak in Turkey on business, weren't you?
Yeah, well, I actually landed in Istanbul, and then I got onto a vessel at the Sea of Marmara where they cross over, and from the Black Sea crosses over to the Strait of Bosphorus, and then there's a bridge there connecting Europe and Asia, and then on the other side of that is the Black Sea. So the Black Sea to the north, the Sea of Marmara, is where it spilled over the Strait of Bosphorus to the south near Istanbul. And you go just farther down into the Sea of Marmara there, on one of those shores is where Schliemann found the city of Troy. So it was right in that that area. You've got it. So it's really amazing. Anyway, how did I get on Turkey? Oh, so now we kind of have an idea of the flood and forward. So at this point, you can start asking some pretty hard questions like, well, did they leave or did they stay? And a lot of people want to know that because they want to know if they're influencing governments and their lives here on Earth. I grabbed my mom, we went on the back porch and watched as it flew over our garden, right over our cow pasture, and then back over the wooded area in the back of our house. It was just rolling hills covered with trees. And it looks like broccoli in the summer when all the trees are in bloom. But at this time of the year, it was actually somewhat later in the year. But we just watched this thing fly close to the tops of the trees, and it was following the contour of the trees, kind of like later in my life, and I'll tell you that part in a minute. I became a helicopter pilot, and we call that napping the earth, how he was flying. So didn't think much about it, and I really never thought about the encounter. I was so close. I mean, probably only 60 feet away, and so I thought. Well, I told my mom, I said, well, maybe it was an advanced military craft that is working with Fort Chaffee down near Little Rock. And that's the direction it was heading. And I never thought about it again. I had never heard of a UFO. We were, this was quite a number of years ago. I won't date myself. Anyway, so that had some influence that I really never recognized until much later in my life when I got into this. So, interestingly enough, when I was in engineering at UCSD studying, I first started out as a computer engineer.
Faithful host James, and I'm so excited to be talking to today's author, Mr. Gerald Clark, and we're going to be discussing Gerald's work, The Anunnaki of Nibiru, Mankind's Forgotten Creators, Enslavers, Destroyers, Saviors, and Hidden Architects of the New World Order. And Gerald is a mechanical engineer, and I just love having fellow engineers on the show to discuss ancient history. I seem to be collecting a lot of these authors on the show, and people can refer to the archives for the other shows. And this is what brings merit to the show. And Gerald's going to get into a little bit about his career and how he got into this wonderful subject himself. So I don't want to ruin the biography. And so without further ado,
and I got my graduate degree in electrical engineering. And so as an undergrad, I had an interest in all things artificial intelligence because I worked at an AI company for 7 years. And we did lots of research into how the brain works, how to write computer models of the brain, how to do situation assessment, how to do sensor fusion, and apply what we do in complex situations as humans to try to teach machines to do this. You know? In retrospect, it doesn't sound like a very good idea, does it? So during that exposure to artificial intelligence, I learned about a couple of things, and they really interested me because I had an interest in evolution, just the evolution of man. I was a truth seeker in a sense, you know, and I was watching Australopithecus africanus, the famous Lucy artifacts that showed up in the San Diego Natural History Museum, and I definitely went to see that because I had read about this. I was like, wow, could this be our missing link? You know, I was way back at the time where people were still recovering from the false missing link fiascos that have gone down, like Piltdown Man and all the other things that have happened in the past. But this one looked interesting because you know, there were real bones that you could check out. So I had an interest in evolution and really never really realized that part of my influence and my drive to figure out the state of the world happened when I was 14. And I was in the front yard of my kind of remote farm in the northwest corner of Arkansas. And we were about, I don't know, 12 miles north of where Walmart started. Actually, that's where we lived, if you know where that is in the country. Anyway, little unknown fact there. I was standing out in the yard kicking a ball up in a walnut tree about 5 or 5:30 p.m. It was real calm. Usually, you know, at the end of the day when the sun's starting to chill out, the thermals have stopped and it's very still. One of my favorite times. But anyway, I'm kicking a ball up in the tree trying to knock walnuts down. And suddenly, something caught my attention just to my right in a little cow field just across this dirt road where we lived. And a silver disc at about 100 feet off the ground was just hovering, coming north to south very slowly, not even 5 miles an hour, very slow. And I thought, oh my gosh, whatever that is. You know, my primal instinct, I was a pitcher in baseball, is to pick up a rock and throw it at me. And I thought, no, I don't think that's a good idea. And I just sat and watched it. And then I ran the house.
Well, let's bring in our guest. Hi, Gerald. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Capricorn Radio.
Hi, James. It's really great to be here. And I want to wish a warm welcome to all your listeners.
Oh, thank you, brother. Thank you. And like I said in the intro, we've got a mechanical engineer here.
Well, actually, I'm an electrical engineer, so.
Oh, sorry. I do electromechanical. I don't distinguish between the two.
No.
Gerald. Sorry, you're electrical engineer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you got into some wonderful breakdown in the book, which is why I think your book about the Anunnaki is so different to most out there. And you know, I think a lot of people have took Sitchin's work and carried the flag and kept going and, you know, looked into all the text and stuff, Gerald. And you've applied an engineering and scientific discipline to this, too, Gerald, as well. And that's what gives you body and a difference to the other people out there. Before we get into the book, Gerald, let's tell me about you, the author. Tell me about Gerald, the engineer. How you got into this subject? It's a bit of a turnaround from your career. Is this a hobby? Have you always been into history? What was the catalyst that got you into this subject, Gerald?
It's a good question. I've told this version of the story multiple times. I actually